be engaging with the premiers in the coming weeks to establish a strong position for Canada, so that people know that Canada's years of being a less than enthusiastic actor on the climate change file are behind us.
That was Justin Trudeau promising action on climate change after his recent election win. With the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Paris set to begin at the end of the month, he's got his work cut out for him. Canada's environmental reputation has come under attack after it became the only country to withdraw from the Kyoto Accord after missing emission reduction targets. The previous Conservative government had targeted a 30% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 based on 2005 levels. Critics said it wasn't enough. Trudeau has invited the premiers to accompany him to the Paris talks and will meet with them within 90 days to hammer out a plan to address climate change. During the campaign, Trudeau said he'd set up a $200 million a year fund to support innovation and clean technology in the resource sector, and another $100 million to support clean technology companies. And he said Canada would join other G20 nations in putting an end to subsidies given to the fossil fuel industry. But Trudeau says he supports the building of Keystone XL pipeline while opposing the Northern Gateway pipeline. The upcoming talks in Paris hope to finalize a global climate treaty aimed at controlling greenhouse gas emissions. So what should Canada's priorities be? Time for E Squared. Tom Rand is Senior Advisor of Mars Cleantech and author of Waking the Frog, and Ken Green is Senior Director at the Centre for Natural Resources at the Fraser Institute. So let's ask both of you, what should Justin Trudeau's priority be in Paris? Let's start with you, Ken.
Well, you know, changing politicians doesn't really change the nature of the challenge that Canada faces. We're a very energy-intensive society, as are most of the developed countries. It is quite costly to attempt to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So one needs to be leery, I think, of promising things that you can't deliver on, which has been the case in past governments, in many governments around the world, as a matter of fact. But again, I think Canadians' expectations should be reined in a bit, because the fundamental nature of the UN process hasn't changed. It's still a giant conflict over money to move from the developed countries to the developing countries. And it's unlikely that the major emitters in the world are going to accept binding targets. So I would diminish expectations a bit.
Tom, do you agree with that? Diminish expectations?
Well, no. Look, it's a complicated problem for sure. But I would take exception to the idea that reducing emissions is expensive. BC has demonstrated you can reduce emissions without much cost at the beginning. But the longer game here is, it's true, Ken's right, don't make a promise if you can't keep it. And so the real challenge is, and we've actually made a commitment, like the way this process works is countries are coming forward with their own emissions reductions target. They come up with them by themselves voluntarily, and they figure out their own way to meet those emissions reductions targets. So every country is doing that. What's interesting is that it's being driven a lot now by bilateral agreements based on economic self-interest. And I think what I hope to see come out of this is Canada begin to engage in the conversation around emissions reductions, shifting from sort of obligation to opportunity. That really what we're doing is we're rewiring the global economy. It's going to happen sooner or later, and countries that figure that out can get in on that action, so to speak. So the real challenge is going to be, when the promise is made, it's already been made, is how we divvy up the emissions reductions priorities between provinces. That's going to be very complex, and I think the heavy lifting has already been done by several provinces, and the feds have to find a role to play when Ontario, BC, Quebec have already acted. And Alberta,
so I have to make two points. One being that BC's carbon emissions have not gone down; they're going back up. And neither of Quebec's. So the schemes that are in place in those places are not actually reversing the trend of growing greenhouse gas emissions. And I would also point out that all of the targets agreed to by the countries going to the Paris talks are insufficient to achieve what, Tom, your gold standard target is of limiting predicted warming to less than 2 degrees C. No matter how ambitious these targets are, and it's very doubtful that most countries will make their targets, it's still not going to be sufficient in your case, in your opinion, to ward off the problem.
So why don't you tell me what the solution is, Ken?
Well, I think the solution is to focus much more on adaptation than it is to focus on mitigation. We've gone this route before.
What does that mean?
We know how to adapt. We don't know how to mitigate.
So to be clear, adaptation is going to be cheaper then mitigation. That's the premise you're committing to?
What does adaptation mean exactly to you, Ken?
Really?
Well, adaptation basically consists of making society more resilient in the face of potential changes, whether that's drought, flooding, increased sea levels, storms, and so forth. And we know how to do that. Look, people live in California where there are giant earthquakes. They live in Japan and other countries where there are giant storms, and we know how to adapt to these things.
So you're just saying get ready for climate disaster and we can brace ourselves for it?
No, I don't actually believe we're headed for a climate Armageddon. I'm a lukewarmer. I believe we're headed for a moderate degree of warming based on at the lower end of the UN's IPCC spectrum of 1.5 to 2 degrees C.
Yeah, so, on a Friday night about 11 o'clock, I like to believe that cigarettes don't cause cancer either, but it's not really, hope isn't really something to live on in that case. So look, adaptation is going to happen regardless. The world is going to get warmer. And what I'm really happy about, Ken, is that the world's leaders and the real thinkers and movers and shakers, the CEOs of big companies, are no longer attracted to your position. It is no longer tenable to say in public, let climate change happen, it's not going to be that bad, and we can adapt anyway. That line of thinking is out, and I'm glad that it's out. And Godspeed to you keeping it up.
Let's see if the rest of Canada goes the way of Ontario, with skyrocketing power prices, amongst the highest in North America, with 40% to 50% more hikes coming baked into the Green Energy Act pie. Let's see if when push comes to shove, provincial leaders are really willing to break their banks and transfer large amounts of wealth to other provinces and even other countries. Quebec will wind up buying carbon permits from California. Are Canadians really ready to transfer wealth to California? I don't think so.
Again, it's a complicated problem. It's a difficult problem. I've acknowledged that long ago. The real nuance in this debate comes down to how do you solve the problem, not let the problem occur. So when I ask you, Ken, in good faith, what is your solution? Can you give me something other than I don't really worry about climate and I'll adapt? Can you give me some nuance?
We'll have to get that another day, and we'll have to be watching to see what Trudeau comes up with in Paris. Thanks both of you for being here.